So one thing I always struggled with when I was learning how to code is how do I actually structure my code in a more professional way, or how do I make this cleaner so that when I come back later, it doesn't confuse me? And I think that's one thing that a lot of YouTube tutorials don't really touch on. They kind of just write perfect code and they don't really show you how they arrived at that point. And as you gain more experience, you kind of bypass those steps in your head, right? In your head, you have like this idea of how you can write code already, and you know the best ways to write it or ways that can be efficient. But when you're a beginner, you might be doing a lot of stuff that's kind of dirty or ugly. So I'm going to show you some code that I wrote. This is all mine. I kind of intentionally wrote it as if like a newbie was doing stuff. Like maybe they're learning JavaScript for the first time and they're doing like promise chaining instead of async await, or they are doing just nested functions inside of functions or various for loops. We're going to walk through this and I'm going to show you how you can refactor this to be a little bit cleaner so that other people can easily read it and understand the intent of this entire function. So definitely stick around. You're going to learn a lot if you watch this video. And secondly, I am going to try to add in some testing, because testing is another topic that a lot of videos don't even mention, which is strange because it's one of the most important things that you'll learn when you become a professional software engineer. If your system or application doesn't have tests covering the code, then you're writing poor quality software, in my opinion. All right, so a little overview. We have a TypeScript file, and just don't be worried if you don't know what TypeScript is. I'm using just a little bit of TypeScript flavoring to make this easier to understand and follow. So this code basically is an application where you have an array of students, and those students have an array of test scores. The idea is you pass this data into the program, it calculates the average grade for the class, and if you got below a 60%, it's going to send you an email saying you failed the class. Let me actually kind of show you. So if I run this with TypeScript, so I type npx tsnode and then pass it the file, what that's going to do is compile or interpret the TypeScript, run it as JavaScript in Node. And since this student failed the class, if you look at their grades, you got 0, we got 70 and 60. So if you average those up on paper, you can determine that this is going to be below 60. And what happens is it's going to send out an email. So if I go to this site, this is an example of where the email is going to go. It says you failed your courses. It's sending it to the webdevjunkie@example.com. You failed. All right. So the application works, right? Just wanted to prove that to you. And then also if I do like 100, you'll notice that it doesn't do anything. It doesn't print anything because no student has failed. There's no email link that's printed out. So let's kind of walk through the code and kind of explain what's going on here. So we have a main function that takes in an array of students, right? So in TypeScript, you can say the arguments is going to be of type student, which basically is going to loop through the array and check if your student data has everything that you need. So let me just kind of show you what happens. If I were to remove like name from this, you'll notice that this whole thing turns red because TypeScript is saying, hey, one of your student objects is actually missing a property name, right? So that's really useful if you're a beginner, which is why I highly recommend that you learn to code with a statically typed language. There's so many times I've wasted hours just trying to do something when I just left off like a property, or I misspelled something, or I called something ages instead of age. Big time saver. But anyway, I'm getting kind of distracted. So let's go into the function. Let's kind of cover what's going on here. So when you're first reading through this function, you see that we're declaring a variable called getGrade, which happens to be a function, right? This function takes in a student ID, and you can see here it's basically looping through all the students. It's trying to find the student that has the matching ID. And if we find that student, so we're looping through all the students, if we find the student that matches the ID that was passed in, we're going to cache that student somewhere up here, and then we're going to break out of this for loop, right? So we found the student by ID, and then we have a check to say if the student is null or undefined, we return -1. And then what we're doing is we're basically summing up the student's course grade. So we have a let equals 0 here. We loop through all the test scores. We grab each grade, we add it to a sum variable, and then we divide it by the total length, right? So this is just computing the average basically of all the test scores, right? So off the bat, this code is super confusing. There's a better way you could write this code, and we're going to actually refactor this to look pretty nice in a second. But let's just continue down because there's not that much left to kind of explain. So the second one is we need to keep track of all the students who have failed the class, right? So we have this fails array, and we loop through all the students, and we say for each student, give me the grade of the student, and we pass in the student ID. And we say if the grade is less than 60, we need to push that student into a fails array, right? So this should all hopefully make sense. And then after we've checked to figure out which students have failed, we loop through the fails array. And for each one, we are calling this node mailer create test account, which will make an account. We make a transporter. This is needed for the library that we're using to basically publish to that UI we saw. It's just kind of configuring, saying like, where do you need to push the email to and what's the username and password. And then we actually send out the email. So we say here, send out the mail. Going to go from WebDevJunkie to whatever the student's email is. And then when that's done using promise chaining, we then print out the email link. And then we also say sending an email to this person. And then finally, we have a catch statement. So the first thing I would do before you actually touch any code is you need to have some type of testing, right? Unit testing is by far one of the first lines of defense that you can have in place to make sure that your code is doing what your code needs to do. All right, and if you're not really interested in learning how to write tests using Jest, then I would just skip forward. But I think this is one of the most important parts of this process. You shouldn't be changing code unless there's tests to cover the code, because when you're on a project with a lot of people, with a lot of code, you don't know if the line that you're changing might break other functionality or other pages in your application, okay? So you want to install some type of test runner. So I'm gonna install Jest here, which is just a testing library. And you can actually create a test file once you install that. So I'm going to say index.test.js, or sorry, .ts. So in this file, you can do a describe block. And inside the describe block, you can put a description. So typically you put the actual name of the file or the name of the component that you're trying to test. In our case, we will just use index because why not? After that, you have to pass it a callback function. Okay, this function, let me zoom in just a little bit. This function also takes a bunch of calls, right? You need to call a bunch of it statements. The it statements are used to basically describe what the test is doing. So I'm going to say should send out an email if the student failed. We're just going to do one test for this little tutorial, but you can write as many as you want. And the more that you have, the more coverage, the better it is. So I think it is complaining because I don't have some types installed. So I think I need to install the TypeScript types for the Jest library. All right, and then it's good, okay? So I just want to make sure that this works. So inside this it statement, you can write something called assertions, right? So I can say expect true to be truthy. And when you do that, you can actually run your tests and you should verify that they pass. So to run this test file, I'm gonna go ahead and copy the relative path and say npx jest and paste that in. So this is going to take this test file and it's going to run it. And if the expect statements all turn out to be true, then the test passes. Also, I can do this. If I say expect false and run that, it's going to fail my test suite. And this is super important because now we can go back in here and refactor our code and know if we broke something, okay? Because I showed you that this code works before, but now it's not working. So let's just take this a step further. Again, if you don't want to learn about testing, just skip forward, but I think this is super important to understand. So now that we have a really simple test file written and we've saw how we can run that test file, what we want to do is we want to import the module that we're trying to test. All right, so over here we have an index.ts file, and the majority of the components, I have to zoom out just a little bit so I can see more code. It's very hard to code with a zoom in of 4. So hopefully if you're on your phone, you can still see that. I'm on a zoom level of 3 now. But again, by writing a test over this, it can help you see how bad your code is structured. Right now, there's no way to verify that the code that we're writing does what we want. So what we need to do is we need to export this main function so that we can import it inside of our test file. Additionally, we're going to have issues because this runs every time someone imports this TypeScript file. So I want to copy that out, and I could just cut it out, and I'm going to paste that directly into my test. Okay. So I'm going to say, I'm going to run main, and I'm going to pass it all of this logic that we did before. So this should be a failing person. Go ahead and put like 0, 30, and 60 to verify that it is failing. And we're going to make sure that we import that file here. So I'm going to import the main function from that index file. All right, so now the next step is we can't just run this function. We need to actually expect that once we run these input parameters, it's going to try to send out an email, right? The test is saying should send out an email if the student failed. So I'm going to go back to this code here. I'm going to figure out a way, how can I make this basically check if it's sending out an email? So one way you can do this is basically using something called spies, all right? So in order to have Jest verify that node mailer is called and all this other stuff is basically invoked, what we could do instead is we want to do something called dependency inversion. So we're going to do some more advanced refactoring here. We're going to take all this code out and we're going to put it in a different function. Okay, so I'm going to take all this code and I'm going to rename it to send failed email to a student, right? So up here, I'm going to go ahead and just say const send failed email, and I'm going to have that send out to fail. Okay, so right now we're already in the process of writing a little bit of cleaner code. So let's paste all that code in. That was once ran inside of this main function, but now what we're doing is we are basically calling it like this. So this code's already a little bit cleaner. But again, what we're trying to do is we want to be able to verify that this, when we call this, an email is sent out. So we need to do something called spying. And what we can also do to make this easier to spy on is we can do something called dependency inversion. So instead of this function directly importing this file over here, or directly referencing this function over here, we could have this main function actually take in something called, I don't know, we could have this take in a mailer function. So I'm going to say send email function. It's just a function. I think it needs to be capital F. So now what happens is instead of main calling this down here, we're going to just have this call whatever function was passed in. And what this allows us to do is basically mock out and verify that whatever was called is actually invoked. Okay, so let me go here and minimize this a little bit. I hope I haven't lost you all already. This is like more advanced stuff, to be honest, but I think it's good to learn, so hopefully I help someone out. What we're going to do now is we need to send in a spy here, or a stub, whatever you want to call it. So we're going to say const mailer is equal to jest.fn. So this is going to make a jest, I guess you can call it a mock or a spy, but it's basically a function that you can invoke, and when it's invoked, you can verify that it was invoked. So I'm going to say mailer function. Let me do this. And I'm going to pass that in as the second argument here, say. So we're passing in the first argument, which is the array of students, and then we're also passing in the mailer function. So what we've done is we've done a form of dependency inversion so that we can actually verify that certain external calls are happening. All right, so after all this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put in a wait in front of here because I think this is going to be an async function. We need to go back to main and make sure that main is also async. Put it in the wrong spot. So this needs to be async. And we are going to basically await on this send email call right here. All right, so going back here, again, let's just minimize test scores or something. We want to, after we call the main function, we need to say expect mailer function to have been called. All right, so what this test is doing is verifying that if we pass in a test score that's failing, the spy or the mock that we're passing into this function should be invoked. All right, so if we actually go back to the code, we can see that at some point in this function, it should have looped through all the failing students and it should send out an email. So if we did this right, we should be able to run this test and it should pass. It probably won't pass first time. So in order to run this test, in order to run Jest with TypeScript, you do have to install some things. So I'm going to go ahead and just install a couple of these things. So I need to install a Babel preset TypeScript. So npm install save dev. Go ahead and install that. And then also it says, I need a Babel config. Okay, so let's just go here and make a Babel config while that's installing. And we are going to go ahead and copy in this example. Let's see. So we have to install the types. We already did that. I think, let me try running it again and see if it still complains about me using an import statement here. Okay, so I think I need to also install this one. So no biggie, we're just doing a little bit of live debugging here. This happens. This wasn't really a planned video other than the code that I wrote. So this is going to turn into a long example. So, okay. It's running now. Everything's working. We got the Babel config set up. So I think what this is basically doing is it's telling Jest to like, hey, when you see a file, just allow it to compile down to TypeScript so that you can do an import statement. But again, before you set stuff up, make sure you read the docs. I kind of skipped ahead, so that's my bad. All right, so this test is passing now. We are verifying that when we run this code and we pass in an array of students, this mailer function is called. So to verify this is a very good thing to do with testing, is make sure that the test fails when you comment out or change the code to break the test. So let's just go ahead and comment out the left side. And notice it's saying that it expected this to be called once, but we never got any calls. So our test is actually good. This is a good test. I'm going to go ahead and add this code back. So now what we need to do is verify the other case, right? There's another scenario where if the student is passing, we shouldn't be sending out any email. So I'm going to copy this entire block and I'm going to paste it down here. And I'm going to make sure that the student is passing. So I'm going to give him like a 90, 100, and a 70. So if you were to average those, you could assume that the average is going to be over 60. So this test, we need to rename it and says should not send out an email if the student passed. All right, so we're kind of testing both use cases of this function. If the student fails, send an email. If the student passes, don't send an email. So we need to say verify or expect that the mailer function has not been called. So I'm going to put a not in front of this, and this is how you do it in Jest. And now if I run this Jest test file again, we have 2 passing tests, okay? So this ends the section about how to write test files using Jest over your code. And again, the reason we're doing this is because if I went through here and just tried to refactor stuff, there is a huge chance that I'm going to break something, right? There's a high chance I'm going to accidentally spell something wrong, or I'm going to do some logic wrong. The email's not going to get sent anymore, and it's going to take me a long time to debug it. Versus now, when I change some code, I just have to run this test file. If it's all green, I know I can continue forward. Or if it's red, I could maybe revert back. If I'm using GitHub or source control, I can revert my changes back and try again. All right, so I hope that was not too advanced for you all. If it was, then I apologize, but it's important to know. It's important to understand. So now for the part that you've kind of been waiting for is how do I refactor this code more? Because now this is not actually sending out the email, right? So if I actually run using tsnode, so npx tsnode, if I run this file, it's not going to actually send out anything because now it's not actually calling this function. So let's just look at this function first and see how we can clean this up. I'm going to put this in its own file because we can try to make this a utility function that is basically ran just to send out some emails. So I'm going to make a mailer.ts file. I'm going to go ahead and paste all that code in, and I'm going to go ahead and export this. So I'm going to say export mailer. And really what this function needs to do is it just needs to take a to address, and then probably it needs to take a topic or a subject. I'm just going to say subject. We can make this more complex if you wanted to. But for right now, we're going to keep it simple. So I'm going to say pass it to, and then subject, we are just going to kind of hack this all in. I'm going to just basically put all this. All right, so put subject here. And then this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I import node mailer. Because remember before we had a dependency on node mailer, which we imported up here. I'm going to go ahead and cut that out and just paste it in the top of this file. And I think this should hopefully help us out. Let's just go ahead and delete some of this code. So now remember, we used to be able to run this index file and it would actually send out an email, but now it's not. So we need to go down here and probably rename this file as well. So I'm going to name this as like student checker. Again, naming is so hard to do. Like just pick something that kind of makes sense. And once we've renamed this file to student checker, we can then export that file and we can make a new index. So I'm going to make a new index file and I'm going to say import student checker from student checker. And then we can call it just like we did in the unit test over here. So again, what I'm showing you here is now that like we don't want that main file to do all this logic. We just want to have a function that does a lot of that logic for us. So I'm just going to refactor this. And instead of passing mailer function, we are going to import the mailer here from mailer. All right. So we got the student checker function that we're calling. We're passing a student, and then we are going to pass in the mailer function. Okay, so now I should be able to run that file. So I'm going to say npx tsnode, and then I'm going to call index.ts. Oops. Cannot find module index.ts. It's because I renamed this to JavaScript. My bad. All right, so let's try running this. It should try to send out a mailer. Mailer has no exported function called mailer. So let's go to the mailer file, and I need to rename this to just mailer. So let's run this. All right, I think that's a good step. So let's go back to the index. The issue that we're running into is, on the student checker, this function changed, right? This is supposed to be just the mailer here, and it takes in two arguments. It takes in the two, so I'm going to say fail.email, and then it takes in a subject. You failed the class. So let's see if this runs now. The subject implicitly has any type. Okay, so this is like a TypeScript error. Basically, they don't want you to have any types defined. We need to actually specify what this is. So I'm gonna say this is gonna be a string, and this one is gonna be a string. Hopefully that works now. All right, cool. So it sent out an email. We can see that it says you failed the class. That's in the subject. Again, what I'm trying to show you is like I'm just refactoring code to make it easier to understand and cleaner. Because a lot of beginners, they're just going to put everything in the same file, and it's going to get really out of hand and messy. So I'm showing you how you go from a single file to like a more structured project, a more cleaner project, and then also showing you some more advanced topics of like how to use dependency inversion in testing. But I'm sure I've lost a majority of my viewers already because this is probably intense. So let's go back to the test file. I did rename some stuff. So in order to fix this test file, we want to rename it because this test file was really just testing the student checker. So let's rename this as student checker test.ts. And we want to make sure that we import that and rename that. I think down here as well. So let's just run that and verify that we didn't break anything. Let me make sure I run the right test file. Everything is still green, so we are good. We have ran the test file. That means that our refactoring is still working fine, which makes sense because we didn't really change anything else in this function other than this. Okay. All right. So now what we want to do is we can do the fun part of actually like refactoring more code. The first thing I'm going to do is look at this function here. It's a nested function. So we have a function called getGrade. It's nested inside a student checker. And the question is why is this nested? Do we even need to nest this function? And the reason I don't like nested functions is because it's really hard to know what the function is using. This function could be using any of these arguments passed in, but additionally, it could be using any of these. So just by looking at this code, like you can see that, okay, it is actually accessing students here, which when you have a bigger nested function, it could be accessing a lot of stuff. So I want to just pull this out and put that at the top here, right? And now you'll see that, oh, this was actually accessing students. So maybe students needs to be passed in. I'm going to say that's an array of student. And instead of calling this getGrade, you'll see down here it's failing. So I'm going to pass in students. But instead of calling it getGrade, I could say like getAverage course grade. How about that? That's a much better name. So I showed you, be very cognizant of what you're naming your functions. The more descriptive you are, the better. Like, I don't care if this is 15 words. If the description helps another programmer understand the intent of the function, then name it as long as you need to. So we made a change. Make sure you rerun your tests. Make sure everything passes. And we got 2 green arrows, so we are good to continue on with what we're doing. So let's look at this again. Get average course grade. You have to ask yourself, why is this even looking at all the students? Why can't we just pass this the test scores? Or why can't we just pass it the student? Okay, so I like to pass as little information as you can to functions so that you don't couple a lot of like student model structure with your functions. So I think what you need to do is you need to pass in an array of test scores. So I'm going to say test, refactor this and just say test scores. That needs to be an array of test scores. And instead of like looping through the students here and stuff, we just need to loop through the test scores, which happens to be passed in. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove all this code here. And make sure that the test scores length is what's called. So now this function is so much cleaner. We know what it's doing. Get average course grade, takes in a list of test scores. It sums them up and computes the average and returns that. So we did break the agreement here, so we have to kind of fix this. What we want to do instead is say student.testScores. And I think that should fix that. So let's just go ahead and rerun this and see what happens. We got 2 green arrows, so our function is working, our code is still good. So look how much cleaner this function already is. Like we split up a lot of code, we put it in other files. Can we make this cleaner? And in fact, I think we can. So what I would like to do is, instead of having like this push into a fails array, we could kind of just do this with a for each loop or something. So I'm going to say students. Actually, I'm going to do a filter. So I'm going to say students.filter. And I'm going to say get average course grade of the students' test scores. So I only want the students who failed. So I'm going to say const get failed students is a function that looks like this. And actually, it's going to be a function that calls that function. Okay, so this is just creating like a pulling out a function that we can use for a filter. We're going to pass that into the filter. And then for every student that failed, since we've done a filter, we can do a for each on the failed student. And we could just simply call this function, I think. So let's say call failed student.email. Now, the only issue when you're doing this is that you can't use async await. So let's just verify that this is actually working firsthand. All right, 2 green arrows. Our code is still working as it did before. And I just want to verify if I commented this out or something, or if I change this to like -20, does this test case still fail? And it does. It's saying that it should have tried to send out an email, but it didn't. So again, our test cases are verifying that what we're doing is good. Now, if you want to get technical, sometimes you want to await on the promises before you do anything. If you're familiar with Node and JavaScript, it works kind of like in an async manner. So what I would like to do is put this all in a promise. So I could say await promise.all. And we actually want to change this, instead of a for each, we can say map. So we're going to return an array for every student here. So let me do this. And let's see, what am I missing? All right, here we go. So this might be a little bit more advanced, but this is the code that I would prefer to write. So basically we're saying we're going to do some logic, and we need to wait for all of it to finish before the student checker is done. And what this logic is doing is saying, give me all the failed students. So, calculate the test scores of every student who's under 60. Give me all the failed students. And for each one, we're going to return a new promise, which happens to just send out an email. Okay, so this code still works perfectly. It's a lot cleaner than it was. Everything's split up in the files. We had different logic. And this, in my opinion, just looks beautiful. So we could also refactor this mailer function a little bit. Now, if you wanted to analyze the mailer, the first thing I noticed about it is that it's using promise chaining. I would not use promise chaining. It's just harder to understand unless you really need to use it for some reason. There are instances where you need to use it. I also don't like comments. I think comments are bad. If you have to add comments, that means that you don't actually have clean code and it's not descriptive about what's going on. So instead of doing promise chaining, I'm going to say await on this. And then I'm just going to say const info is equal to that. And then if there's an exception, that should just be thrown already. In order to use async await, we have to actually do some more stuff. So we need to create a test account as well. Again, we could use promise chaining here. So I'm going to say test account. I'm sorry, we're going to use async await here. So this will create us a test account. And then we get a transporter here like we did before. And then we are using that transporter to send out an email, and then we print that stuff out. So again, our test cases should pass because they're not verifying this mailer function. But if I were to run PS Node, that should hopefully send out an email. Let's see, we have a little error, get failed students. Oh, it's because I didn't put anything here. This needs to be student. Let's see if this works. All right, this definitely sent out an email again. So, but you could also actually use reduce here if you wanted to. If you want to get real fancy, you can do something called reduce to sum everything up. Let's just do that real quick. So I can say test scores reduce. That's going to take in a function with an accumulator and a current. And we are going to return the accumulator plus the test score.grade. Let me rename this to test score. And then we're going to start that accumulator off at 0 and divide it by test scores. What's going on here? I think it's complaining because I just have to like make sure why is this complaining? Test score.grade, I'm adding it to the sum. Test scores. Oh, my bad. So yeah, I was missing an S here. That's why it's complaining. Yeah, so now we have basically the same logic that should be summing up. And what I would actually do is, you probably want to verify this as well. I would probably export this and write a unit test over that, but we should be able to verify that the tests are working still. So let's run Jest one more time to make sure we didn't break anything. And it looks like we actually did break something. So I think it's because I'm not dividing by test scores.length, right? Whenever you compute average, you want to make sure you divide by the total number of items. So that's passing again. Again, what I would do is I would export this function. I know it's a private method, and some people say you shouldn't be exporting private methods to test them. But if it helps, I think you should. Let's actually rename this the student checker. So another thing you do in Jest is you can have multiple describe blocks. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and add another describe. At least I think you can have multiple describes. I'm going to put this function get average course grade, because we want to verify that this function is tested, because it has some crazy logic with reducer and stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and import that, and we want to basically verify that it should compute the average of the test scores. Okay, so we can call it and say compute the test score, or compute the average of, I don't know, grade is 80. Forget what else we need with the test score here. I think we called it grades, subject, and topic. The topic could be like math, and subject could be adding numbers, something, who knows. I'm just doing this because it's going to complain, because I won't, if I'm using TypeScript, and it'll complain if I don't like pass what I need it to. Let's just compute the average or something. I think if I just do two numbers and say like 90 and 80, I think average should be like 85, right? So expect average to equal 85. Let me just go ahead and rerun that test suite, and now you should see hopefully 3 green check arrows. You see that it ran our student checker test, and it also ran that new test that we wrote. And again, just to show, I should have written the test beforehand before I refactored this function, because remember, I forgot to divide by length. So if I run this test again, you'll see that it actually fails, saying that, hey, something's going wrong with this math. You probably need to recheck it. So now I can make this pass and everything is good. Cool. So that basically sums up everything I wanted to talk about. I know I covered a ton of stuff. Covered like testing. I covered a little bit of TypeScript. I covered how to pull stuff out into separate files and modules. I showed you how to maybe use filter or .map to loop over arrays instead of doing for loops like we were doing before. I also showed you how to basically use dependency inversion to abstract the function to make it easier to test inside your unit tests. I showed you how to use a Jest spy like this. You can basically create a function in Jest, and that by default is going to be a spy that you can expect things on. Like I expect it to be called. I could expect it to be called 12 times if I wanted to. You can actually say like, I think it's times. So I could do like this. So a lot of cool stuff. If you had more students, you could actually do that. Like let's say I had 2 students in this array. Well, I need this to be called twice, right? If there's 2 failing students, I need it to be called twice. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of cool stuff. I hope this helps you. I know this is a little bit advanced, but I think if you can grasp this concept of how to write tests, how to refactor, how to split stuff up, you're going to be on a good path to writing some really beautiful code. All right, thank you so much for watching. If you have any comments, leave them below. If you enjoyed this style of video, let me know. I'll keep making videos like this. I think this is one thing that is lacking in the YouTube community, is how to take crappy code and refactor it to be nicer. And like always, subscribe to this channel if you're new, because I'm going to be publishing other videos like this in the future that should hopefully help you become a better web developer.